Now, a pinhole camera is not a very good way of seeing. It does produce a sharp image, but because it's so narrow, you hardly get any light in. The answer to this problem is that ingenious device, the lens. Nautilus has a pretty poor eye compared with its relatives, the squids and octopuses, because they do have a lens. And so we can't help wondering, why doesn't Nautilus have a lens? Why didn't it evolve a lens? Well, I suspect that Nautilus may have got itself stuck on a little peak some way up Mount Improbable. You see that although we've got one big peak there, there are various other peaks on the way. There are quite a lot of them. And since the rule in evolution is just to keep going uphill, when the ancestors of Nautilus came up the track here, up the path here, and got to this point, that way uphill looked just as inviting, so to speak, evolutionarily, as that way. Both of them were uphill. Evolution has no foresight. Evolution has no way of knowing that if you travel up that way, you're going to end up with a lens. For the moment, this appears to be a perfectly good way to travel, because the pinhole camera at this level of illumination is an effective eye. So I wonder whether perhaps Nautilus has got itself trapped on top of this little hillock and is now unable to escape, because escaping would mean going downhill into the valley, and the one thing you cannot do on Mount Improbable is ever go downhill.
Is this guy crazy? Oxford professor, reputation of one of the great geneticists, writes book after book, he's honored. What? I'm telling you, this is just a... You can't stop laughing. This is just a tiny sample. He has built a worldwide reputation as a great scientist, supporting evolution on what? Myths, out of his imagination. He built this whole model here out of his imagination, but he takes it very seriously. I'd love to have you follow him. In the book, I take a little trip with Dawkins up Mount Improbable.
His view, it's just been repeated by us.
Something can come from nothing. Something can come from nothing. Something can come from nothing. You can dispute exactly what's meant by nothing, but whatever it is, it's very, very simple. And why is that funny?
Well, I think it's a bit funny to be trying to define nothing. The trouble, well, there are many troubles with Richard's teachings, but a fundamental one is that he dumbs down God and he soups up nothing.
What scientists are trying to do is to explain how you can get not just something, but the immense complexity of the world, of the universe, and
the immense complexity of the universe? But Richard, in another video you told us this.
A God is a complicated entity which requires a much more sophisticated and difficult explanation than a universe, which is, according to modern physics, a very simple entity.
Well, which one is it, Richard? Is it simple or is it immensely complex? Make up your mind. And this is one of the most prominent atheists in the world today.
When you say faith is rational and evidence-based, I mean, if that were true, it wouldn't need to be faith, would it? I mean, if there were evidence for it, why would you need to call it faith? We only need to use the word faith when there isn't any evidence.
No, not at all. I presume you've got faith in your wife. Is there any evidence for that?
Yes,
on which you base it? Yes,
plenty of evidence. Radicalization is very easy if people are brought up in the first place to believe that faith is a virtue. If you bring up children and tell them that believing without evidence, which is what faith is, Why is that funny?
Well, I think it's a bit funny to be trying to define nothing.
Of course, common sense doesn't allow you to get something from nothing. That's why it's interesting. It's got to be interesting in order to give rise to the universe at all. Something pretty mysterious had to give rise to the origin of the universe. It is literally nothing.
Well,
you can dispute exactly what's meant by nothing. Something pretty mysterious had to give rise to the origin of the universe. It is literally nothing.
If you press Professor Krauss, he admits that he's not really talking about nothing. He himself says, and I quote, "By nothing, I don't mean nothing."
Nothing isn't nothing anymore in physics.
Nothing isn't nothing anymore in physics.
There could be literally nothing from which something suddenly springs. And I mean, it is very hard to grasp it, and I certainly can't grasp it.
So, do you have a degree in theology?
Of course not.
Okay. Are you proficient in Hebrew or Koine Greek?
Of course not.
Okay. So they would theoretically say, how can Professor Dawkins, who's not been theologically trained, technically trained in the original manuscripts, form conclusions about the biblical record?
I love seeing cathedrals. I don't want to enter into any local political disputes.
But local is global these days. If you speak about the value of critical thinking.
I want to see religion die. I mean, I despise all religion. On the other hand, a beautiful cathedral is a beautiful cathedral. And I value the artistic contribution that religion has made over the centuries.
But don't you think that despite all your efforts to popularize critical thinking, to popularize atheism, religion seems to be having some sort of a comeback, not only in this country, but also around the world?
Well, give us a few more decades. Now, as for getting your morals from the Bible, I very sincerely hope nobody does get their morals from the Bible.
Oh my, why would anyone want to get their morals from the Bible? A book that tells us we should love our neighbors, love our wives and husbands, be respectful to our parents, a book that teaches us we shouldn't lie, steal, bear false witness, a book that tells us we should feed the hungry, give to charity, heal the sick. Man, what a terrible set of ideas to follow. Apparently, Richard Dawkins prefers that we have his view of morality, like this.
My passion is for scientific truth. I don't much care about what's good and evil, actually.
Could you imagine what the world would be like if we all shared that attitude?
Religion is not off the table. Religion is not off limits. Religion makes specific claims about the universe which need to be substantiated and need to be challenged and, if necessary, need to be ridiculed with contempt.
Is this really some form of entertainment, to laugh at a madman? If he's telling us our ideas are insane, what does mocking do? If it's an insane idea, what does mocking really do? But there's something deeper with what he is doing philosophically. Two things. Number one is this. He goes on in endorsing a most recent book that has been written, that we now have the answer, how something can come from nothing. And it's this age-old rehashed quantum vacuum that out of which pops up some kind of a particle that, you know, can explain the existence. First of all, it's a misuse of what a quantum vacuum is. No quantum theorist actually tells you that a quantum vacuum is nothing. It's not no thing. There is a pattern, there is the subatomic activity that is going on. So it's not nothing. But suppose it is nothing, meaning no thing whatsoever. What does that do to atheism? I thought atheism's entire definition was everything that is matter. It is a materialistic framework from start to finish. But if the starting point is nothing, then it's not a materialistic framework, it's nothing. And if you're starting from nothing to explain everything, then why not end up in nothing, including meaning? So who's to be mocked here? He's the one who wants to talk about the wonder of beauty and all of this coming out of nothing. That's the insane idea then. That's the thing that needs to be mocked. He's making something out of nothing, making it appear to be nothing, out of which he wants to build everything. It violates the very fundamental starting point of atheism. But this shows you who Dawkins is. He is driven by hate. And that's why many respected atheists want to separate themselves from him. Even secular thinkers took issue with that statement of his and called him to task on it. Dawkins is an angry man, and one day that anger will catch up with him. In a world of civility, you do not mock a counter-perspective. You dialogue with a counter-perspective. You mock a counter-perspective, you provoke the baser instincts in a human being. And somebody violent out there will want to get even with a comment like that. He's playing a very dangerous game.
Look, these people who call themselves Christians actually don't read the Bible, don't go to church, don't believe Jesus was the Son of God, don't even know what the first book of the New Testament is.
But Richard,
it's up to you to make up your mind whether you think they're Christian. Don't ask me. My opinion is not relevant.
Richard, if I said to you, what is the full title of The Origin of Species? I'm sure you could tell me that.
Yes, I could.
Go on then.
On The Origin of Species, on The Origin of Species, there is a subtitle with respect to the preservation of favoured races in the fight, in the struggle for
You're
life.
the high pope of Darwinism.
Not bad,
and
giving some just.
But if you asked people who believed in evolution what that question, and then you came back and said 2% got it right, it would terribly easy for me to go, they don't really believe it after all.
Maybe I alluded to the possibility that some historians think Jesus never existed. I take that back. Jesus existed.
Richard Dawkins is a British evolutionary biologist, outspoken atheist, and popular science author. Dawkins is a prominent critic of creationism and intelligent design. He is described as one of the most influential and profound thinkers in the field of evolutionary theory. The following clip has been public for quite some time now. Richard Dawkins is being interviewed in his own home by prior arrangement with a filmmaking crew. Apparently, according to Dawkins' own website, he doesn't know that they have creationist leanings. They ask him a question that both stumps him and enrages him. His stunning 11 seconds of silence is very, very telling. Once this film clip was made public, Dawkins' cronies immediately came to his defense, claiming the clip was a fake and had been manipulated. Following is the clip.
Can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
Can you just stop when I think...
I'm recording.
Okay.
So, what is the truth? This website is Richard Dawkins' own site, his own answer. It is his direct response to this clip. It is found on this site. By his own admission, the clip is genuine. There is no manipulation. On that site, he attempts to answer the question that stumped him in the interview. The question was simple. Scientifically and logically, it could have been answered with yes, and then an example given, or no, we have not yet found such an example. But instead, on his site, Dawkins engages in about 5 pages of scientific racquetball, bouncing back and forth and intermingling theories to finally arrive at his answer found at almost the very bottom of the page. Following is his answer. After the answer, I will give a layman's interpretation of it. Remember the simple question. Can you give a single example of a genetic mutation that results in an increase in information to the genetic evolutionary process? Dawkins' answer as follows. The answer in practice is complicated and controversial, all bound up with a vigorous debate over whether evolution is, in general, progressive. I am one of those associated with a limited form of yes answer. My colleagues, Stephen Jay Gould, tend towards a no answer. I don't think anybody would deny that by any method of measuring, there has been a broad overall trend towards increased information content during the course of human evolution from our remote bacterial ancestors. People might disagree, however, over two important questions. First, whether such a trend is to be found in all or a majority of evolutionary lineages. Second, whether even in lineages where there is a clear overall trend over the very long term, it is bucked by so many reversals and re-reversals in the shorter term as to undermine the very idea of progress. This is not the place to resolve this interesting controversy, Dawkins says. Here is the layman's translation of Dawkins' revealing admission. The question, he says, is controversial and complex. He admits the question and the answer is controversial, and he means even among evolutionists. And, he says, it is bound up in vigorous debates among evolutionists. Dawkins says that even renowned evolutionists, such as he and Dr. Gould, disagree on the matter. They not only disagree, but they are diametrically opposed. The two most important considerations that evolutionists have on this topic, Dawkins says, is, number one, is information increase even found at all? That was the question that he never answered. And number two, Dawkins says, even the evidence that might appear to be for it is, by his words, bucked by so many reversals and re-reversals as to undermine, his words, the very idea of progress. So, short and sweet, Dawkins paused in the clip because he could not answer the question. There is no clear-cut example of an increase of information in the genome due to genetic mutations, pure and simple. Yet this teaching of genetic mutations being essential to the evolutionary process is one of the foundations of modern evolution theory. Do you smell the rat of pseudoscientific evolution? It seems that Dawkins and many creationists agree. There really is not any clear-cut example of this evolutionary fairy tale. So thank you, Mr. Dawkins, for setting all of that straight, in writing and in your own words.
Richard Dawkins is the undisputed high priest of modern evolution thought. He is also revered by the atheist community since he often goes to great lengths to deny the existence of God, any God, and often he particularly and singularly mocks Christianity and the Creator God of the Bible. This brief film will examine some amazing and revealing statements about evolution and intelligent design, statements made by Dr. Richard Dawkins himself. But more than that, this film will examine Dr. Dawkins' responses once his shocking statements went public on film and were made available, embarrassingly, to the world. Note that in every single example of Dawkins' statements, his claim is that he was duped and fooled. It seems that Dr. Dawkins is a very gullible person, very easy to fool. I wonder if such a gullible person should really be the messiah of modern evolutionary thought. We also wonder if Dawkins is so easily duped and fooled, could it be that he has been duped and fooled by the very theory that he so vehemently espouses to be true? It certainly seems to be a likely possibility. In Ben Stein's shocking expose movie entitled Expelled, there is a segment in which Richard Dawkins is interviewed. Listen to his answer when Ben Stein asks him how life originated.
Well, how did it start?
Nobody knows how it got started. We know the kind of event that it must have been. We know the sort of event that must have happened for the origin of life.
What was that?
It was the origin of the first self-replicating molecule.
Right, and how did that happen?
I told you we don't know.
So you have no idea how it started?
No, nor has anybody.
Nor has anyone else.
So for all the bloviating and fulminating evolutionists who claim that you know how life originated and that you understand the processes behind it all, and that anyone who dares to question the theory of evolution is ignorant, well, you are wrong. According to Dawkins himself, nobody knows how it got started. And if it is so that nobody knows how it got started, why do you insist that evolution be taught as fact to the exclusion of every other idea, especially intelligent design? In fact,
Listen to what your own high priest says regarding the possibility of an intelligent designer.
What do you think is the possibility that intelligent design might turn out to be the answer to some issues in genetics or in evolution?
It could come about in the following way. It could be that at some earlier time, somewhere in the universe, a civilization evolved by probably some kind of Darwinian means to a very, very high level of technology and designed a form of life that they seeded onto perhaps this planet. Now, that is a possibility and an intriguing possibility. And I suppose it's possible that you might find evidence for that if you look at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Because of the complexity of the chemistry of molecular biology, you might find the signature of some sort of designer. Thank you, Dr. Dawkins. You just said what intelligent design proponents have been saying from the beginning. You object when we say it, yet you get to say it, and it is somehow magically scientific. How hypocritical, how disingenuous. Listen to what Dr. Dawkins says next about that higher intelligence.
And that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe. Well, but that higher intelligence would itself have had to have come about by some explicable or ultimately explicable process. It couldn't have just jumped into existence spontaneously. That's the point.
So the higher intelligence itself couldn't have just jumped into existence spontaneously. That was your point? Wow. Yet as you deny the existence of God with all of your might, you insist that everything we now see before us, over 2 million species of life, and as far as we know, only on our planet, it all started by something jumping into existence spontaneously. This is what evolution theory proposes. So the first life on Earth came about from non-life spontaneously, that is, as you say, solid truth, and it must be taught as fact. But a higher intelligence couldn't have done anything like that. Dr. Dawkins, we are beginning to smell the rat of rank hypocrisy and delusion. Listen now as Dr. Dawkins tries to explain himself to a very friendly audience. Obviously, he is embarrassed by his statements in the movie Expelled. You will not believe what you will hear next as his explanation.
I, at that time, had never heard of Ben Stein, and I had been duped by a man called Mathis into taking part in a film which I thought was a serious exploration of science and religion. That's what I was told. I only much later discovered that it was a creationist front and that I had been fooled into doing something that I would never normally have done. When I spoke to Ben Stein, I took him seriously. I thought he was, well, until the end of that interview, as you saw. And when he asked me that question, something like, could you ever imagine any kind of intelligent design, I bent over backwards to try to give intelligent design its best shot. Once again, I was bending over backwards, and once again, it was a case of quote mining. The important point is that anything that could have the attributes of an intelligence, including God's, could not just happen. They would have to have come about by a gradual, incremental process.
Anything that would have the attributes of intelligence could not have just happened. They would have to come about by gradual incremental processes. It seems Dr. Dawkins is talking in circles. In the beginning, he admits that there could have been an intelligent designer because of the complexity of the chemical and biological processes that we presently see. But that intelligence would have had to have come about through a process of evolution. That doesn't even make sense. It is a clear-cut case of circular reasoning. Which came first, the complex biological processes through random incremental process from which would have eventually emerged a higher intelligence, or the higher intelligence that would have had to have been involved in a complex biological process? It seems Dr. Dawkins has stepped on his own theory and crushed it under the hypocrisy of his own circular reasoning. In light of the fact that Dr. Dawkins is so easily duped by ignorant little creationists, and when he is duped, he says the most outlandish things, so much so that he has to explain and apologize to his adoring fans, one can only draw the logical conclusion that Mr. Dawkins is pretty easily duped. By holding to the inane pseudoscience of evolution, replete with its straw man arguments, it is also our contention that Mr. Dawkins has been duped by the very premise of which he is the high priest, and in so doing, he is duping millions upon millions of others.
On pages 157 to 58 of his book, The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins outlines or summarizes what he calls the central argument of my book. And when you look at this argument, the conclusion to which is, therefore, God almost certainly does not exist, it is a patently logically invalid argument. Even if you grant all 6 steps in the argument, the conclusion that God does not exist doesn't even follow logically from the argument. So it's on its face, it's logically invalid. But when you look at the argument more closely, I think it has a number of premises in it that are false. What are these premises? Well, Dawkins says that you cannot infer a designer of the universe based on the complexity in the universe, because this raises a further question, namely, who designed the designer? And that therefore this leaves biological complexity unexplained. Now, this argument on Dawkins' part, I think, is quite inept, because philosophers of science recognize that in order to recognize an explanation as the best explanation, you don't have to have an explanation of the explanation. In order to recognize that an explanation is the best, you don't need to have an explanation of the explanation. Let me give you an example. Suppose archaeologists digging in the earth were to come across artifacts looking like arrowheads and pottery shards and tomahawk heads. It would obviously be justifiable to infer that these artifacts were the products of some lost tribe of people, even if the archaeologists had no idea whatsoever who these people were or how they came to be there. Similarly, if astronauts were to discover a pile of machinery on the backside of the moon, they would be justified in inferring that these were the products of intelligent design, even if they had no idea whatsoever where this machinery came from or who put it there. You don't have to have an explanation of the explanation in order to recognize that an explanation is the best. And similarly, in the case of biological complexity, in order to recognize that intelligent design is the best explanation of biological complexity, you don't need to be able to explain the designer. That can be left an open question for future inquiry. So the argument is inept right from the beginning. In fact, when you think about it, if in order to recognize an explanation as the best, you have to have an explanation of the explanation, that leads immediately to an infinite regress. You need to have an explanation of the explanation of the explanation, and so on to infinity. You would never have an explanation of anything, which would destroy science. So that Dawkins' principle, if adopted, would actually be completely destructive of science. That's how inept this argument is. So that argument doesn't work. Now, Dawkins goes on to defend the idea that a designer wouldn't be a good explanation because he says the hypothesis of a divine designer is more complex than the world that you're trying to explain. An explanation has to be simpler than the phenomenon you're trying to explain, and he thinks a divine designer is less simple than the world, the universe involving all this complexity. Well, that is completely mistaken. When you reflect on the idea that God is an immaterial entity, a spirit, he is a mind without a body, then God is a remarkably simple entity because he has no parts. There's no composition in God's being. An unembodied mind is an entity that is startlingly simple in its nature. So what Dawkins has obviously confused is a mind's ideas, which may be very complex, with a mind itself, which is a very simple entity. So insofar as you're interested in simplicity, the hypothesis of a divine designer is certainly an advance in simplicity, for what it's worth, over the unexplained, contingent complexity of the universe with all its diversity and variations. So I think that Dawkins' central argument is just hopeless. It is logically invalid on the face of it, and moreover it's predicated upon premises that I think are clearly false.
Take any set of animals and identify the same gene in different animals, and you really can do that because the letters of the DNA code, that's the same code in all animals, and you really can find a gene which is the same in, say, all mammals. For example, there's a gene called FOXP2, which is a couple of thousand letters long, and most of the letters are the same in any mammal, so you know it's the same gene. And then you go through and you literally count the number of genes, a number of letters that are different. So in the case of FOXP2, if you count the number of letters that are different between humans and chimpanzees, it's only about 9. So in the case of FOXP2, if you count the number of letters that are different between humans and chimpanzees, it's only about 9. It's only about 9. About 9. If you count the number of letters that are different in humans and mice, it's, I don't know, 30 or something like that. It's, I don't know, 30 or something like that. Actually, frogs have them as well, and you find a couple of hundred that are different. A couple of hundred that are different. So you can take any pair of animals you like, kangaroo and lion, horse and cat, human and rat, any pair of animals you like, and count the number of differences in the letters of a particular gene, and you plot it out, and you find that it forms a perfect branching hierarchy. It's a tree, and what else could that tree be but a family tree? And then you do the same thing for another gene. Having got the family tree for FOXP2, you then do the same thing for another gene, and another, and another. You get the same family tree. You also get the same family tree if you take genes that are no longer functional, that are just vestigial. They're not doing anything. It's like fragments of a document on your hard disk which are no longer being used. They're no longer on the directory, so you no longer see them. Again, you get the same family tree. This is overwhelmingly strong evidence. The only way you could get out of saying that that proves that evolution is true is by saying that the intelligent designer, God, deliberately set out to lie to us, deliberately set out to deceive us.
The rhetoric that this self-professed atheist Richard Dawkins is pushing on society is very, very dangerous. Whether knowingly or unknowingly, Richard Dawkins is actually contributing to a rhetoric that has been meticulously planned by figureheads such as Alice Bailey for many, many years. to see the dismantling of religion, to make way for the rise of the new Luciferian age. As the peoples of the world fall for this and fall away from their long-held beliefs, what we'll see in society is the beginnings of mass disillusionment, huge divisions and conflicts, the erosion of morality, a false form of spirituality merged with science, which is the ultimate goal. And if you do not submit to the one world consciousness of Antichrist, you will be killed. And so, Richard Dawkins, whether his own pursuit or endeavours as an author are genuine in this or not, he's merely a puppet in a much broader scheme that has been penned by many of the most pinnacle figures in fraternities and secret societies for hundreds of years. That is, to put it simply, the rejection of Jesus Christ, the destruction of traditional religion, and the dawning of the golden age of Lucifer.
Peter Tatchell, I would agree that religion is the greatest threat to liberty today, but I think it's also the greatest threat to scientific truth, which is the thing that concerns me a great deal. I would agree that religion is the greatest threat to liberty today, but I think it's also the greatest threat to scientific truth, which is the thing that concerns me a great deal.
As a scientist, I care passionately about the wonderful opportunity that we all have to really understand the world, the universe, life, humanity, where we come from, what it all means. At least part of what religion has always been about is providing answers to those questions. Science provides what I believe to be a closer approximation to the correct answers.
Should we respect faith? I don't think so. Not a crumb of respect, not a grain. They are people, they're deluded for all sorts of understandable reasons, many of them very nice people. We should respect them, but not their beliefs. We should respect them, but not their beliefs.
What do you have to say to someone who has met the risen and living Lord Jesus Christ, who has walked with God for over 50 years, who received the anointing of the Holy Spirit with the same consequences as the early apostles in the book of Acts? Sir, what do you have to say? Because I assure you, for my life, it has been no delusion.
Obviously, I do not share your beliefs, and I think you are hallucinating. That's all I can say.
Here we have a God who wanted to forgive mankind its sins, including, by the way, the sin of Adam, who he presumably knew perfectly well never existed. Nevertheless, he wanted to forgive mankind's sins. Why didn't he just forgive them? Why was it necessary to have a human sacrifice, to have his son tortured and executed in order that the sins of mankind should be absolved? Is that not the most disgusting idea you ever heard? Why didn't he just forgive the sins? Why did he have to sacrifice a scapegoat? To have his son tortured and executed in order that the sins of mankind should be absolved. Is that not the most disgusting idea you ever heard?
Peter Tatchell, I would agree that religion is the greatest threat to liberty today. Also, the greatest threat to scientific truth.
We have some of the greatest scientists in the world that are becoming very religious. Because here they've got Shiva, they've got dances to Shiva, and they are definitely being connected with Shiva.
The greatest threat to scientific truth. scientific truth.
Here's what I worry about coming out of that place, is all this spirit deception, using it to deceive people. They connect spirituality and science together. Imagine what kind of a union that would have. Science and spirituality. Not Christ, but science and spirituality joined together. Man, they've got what they want when that happens.
It's despair to say that we're stuck with religion, and so science is our best shot at understanding things. What I'm about is consciousness raising.